Hello, everyone. My name is Braden Toronto Brooks. I am the founder and owner of Creative Overhaul, a podcast management agency looking to connect valuable information with ambitious individuals. Today, what I'm going to be covering is everything in all aspects to do with making money on your podcast. Whether that is selling a product or service, generating leads, selling advertising spots, all of those points will be covered in today's podcast, going over some examples for the industries that we know about and how to get started. So, we'll get into the first one, which would be selling a product or service directly on the podcast. So, for example, if you are a clothing brand and you have your own lifestyle podcast, if you're going to be mentioning at the beginning or the end of each podcast a new merch line that you've just dropped, or if you are a social media agency um, gaining a lot of traction on a podcast platform, you can always promote your services directly, and it is internal, so it's not like you're going to be charging yourself to do the promotion. We find that the best way to do so is to bring it up during a conversation with a guest. It seems much more natural and less being plugged in. It seems more organic. And the best time would probably be around the middle mark. At the beginning of the podcast, some people might skip. At the end of the podcast, some people might not stick around. Generating leads is probably the most beneficial way of making money on your podcast. So basically, what you would be doing is increasing your vanity metrics, including listeners, downloads, likes on content, generating as much attraction to your product or service as possible. And then your call to action at the beginning and end of your podcast would to be contacting you directly or your business or your assistant, however you're going to be initiating those sales. Um, so for real estate, you could be trying to pitch some coaching course or to sell a home that you have or to be a partner and get somebody to raise capital with you to be able to purchase and rent out a building, whether that's commercial or residential. You could also look into a secondary sale, we'll call it, which is getting them to sign up for a live event that you're hosting. You could get them onto a 30-minute like a 30-minute call to consult about something. You could get them a home value estimate. All those things don't directly correlate to money, but those are valuable leads that could then in turn become some monetary value for you. So that's probably the best example that we have. If you generate leads that are very expensive, all it might take is one individual to hear about you and your credibility and what you provide to reach out. And from what we understand, a lead could be anywhere from 3,000 to 50,000 on first purchase. So a podcast could really turn around if you get the right traffic. Number 3, I believe is yeah, it's number 3, is selling advertising spots on your podcast. So, obviously, this depends on viewership. What will happen is you would be connected with a sponsor for somebody that wants to promote their own product or service. So, for example, if you have a real estate podcast, you might have an accountant that wants to promote on your podcast, or you might have a life insurance person or a lawyer or mortgage broker, anybody in that realm, as long as it is not a conflict of interest, that could be a potential advertiser on your podcast. Depending on the amount of money you can raise is dependent on your viewership, who your audience is demographically, the location of where they are, and where they make purchasing decisions, and the value that's what a value of the lead would be. So a lot of programs that allow you to advertise on your podcast limit you depending on the amount of viewership. So they won't just let us, we've had 3 podcasts launch, they won't just let us start promoting on our podcast. You need to have a specific amount of episodes, or you need to have a specific amount of monthly downloads, or a combination of the 2. So this can be a little bit more difficult for starting podcasts, but this seems to be one of the most reliable ways and easiest ways to be able to generate a steady flow of revenue off of your podcast. If you're getting started, you're probably going to want to lean more towards some of these other methods. Providing premium content is an interesting one where you basically will provide a lot of value on all of your other platforms of social media, email marketing on your website, even through networking events that you have. And then what you'll basically do is make it so that you can either do one of two things. You can create a free podcast and then a VIP section to that podcast, which is blocked by a paywall, or you can just create an entire podcast that needs either a donation to access or it needs primarily a subscription base to be able to operate and to run. So there's different types of podcasting platforms that you can use to be able to do this. At the end of the day, if you built a lot of network and traffic on other platforms, this might be a very good way to instantly turn over those viewers into actual paying clients. So how do we actually get started with all this? Well, the first thing would be to figuring out what the requirements are for all of these different types of advertising platforms. So for example, if we run through these again, selling a product or service directly on the podcast. So for example, with us, I'm going to tell you my business is Creative Overhaul. What we do is social media and we do podcasts. What we want to do is connect experts in their fields with the listeners that are most likely to take action on that information. So we use podcasts as a way to do that. And that costed me nothing. Either than to record this and do the editing to it, costed me nothing. There was no requirement. All I needed was a podcast and a voice. To generate leads, what you would technically need is a business or some secondary way or some primary way of making some revenue and being able to make mention of it and talk about a call to action somewhere in your podcast. Again, no requirement to do this. It seems as if the only requirement that there is selling those advertisement spots on your podcast because you're going to have to provide a substantial amount of listenership or episodes or some sort of credibility to be able to get those advertisers. How are we going to do this to get a little bit more specific? There are some popular advertising networks where you're going to be able to log in as a user, connect your podcast, and they will basically it'll allow you to advertise on your podcast and make some choices if you fit the requirements. Those can be mid-roll, Podcorn, Advertise Cast, Adopter Media, just to get started. But most of all of them, again, have these requirements which cater to the top 1% of podcasters. You can also go your own personal route, which I've seen a lot, which is if you're already an established, for example, real estate investor, and you've been working in the field for 10, 20, 30 years and have a lot of personal network connections, you can reach out to them directly if you only have 3, 4, 5,000 viewers, or I guess I would say downloads or listeners a month. Even if you have a little bit less than that, it doesn't hurt to even just get a couple dollars here and there per month just to mention something on your podcast as is. And then lastly, you could leverage a team's existing network of podcast hosts, sponsors, advertising contacts to help you get the best price and the best opportunities without the requirements of having to have a specific listener amount, but also not having the requirements of being a super big expert with an extensive network to be able to do that. Because both of those have very hard barriers of entry. Not everybody has an extensive network. Not everybody has 10,000 listens. But if you're able to leverage a business that already has these and can make those connections with you, it will eliminate the hassle, the requirement, and be able to generate you some revenue. So Creative Overhaul has done this, has developed an extensive network of sponsors, advertisers, and podcast hosts specifically in the real estate space. As of now, we have over 100 sponsor and advertiser connections that have experience advertising in the real estate podcast industry. And we also have these high quality services with the feedback to provide to you. And we're going to continue to provide as much valuable as possible, whether that's social media, email, website, or this podcast. And in turn, if you could like, rate, and review this podcast, that would be amazing. If you have any ideas, if you can share those with me on our website, www.creativeoverhaul.ca. You can comment on one of our posts, DM us on social media platforms. Instagram is at Creative Overhaul, and that is the exact same for Facebook and LinkedIn. And then our email is contact@creativeoverhaul.ca. And on that note, thank you so much for listening to our third podcast episode. We will see you on the next one. Thank you.